Welcome to the Real Estate Ripoff podcast. I'm Bill Gross at Bill Gross in social media, at Bill Gross Probate in social media. And when I started this podcast, I had in mind a number of different things. One being big corporations. We've covered some of them. But the big kahuna, the real ripoff for the American people, particularly in the real estate space, is your federal government. And I know that sounds controversial. I'm a proud patriot American, and I'm an avowed capitalist. But what's happened is, in my lifetime, as the federal government has increased its control over the real estate market, increasingly Americans get less and less both housing and satisfaction on average as a result. Let's get the details of that. Now, one of the things you'll notice is the federal government has not always been involved in housing. In fact, housing and urban development and all its related industries didn't start until 1956, 1965, part of the Great American Society with Lyndon Johnson. And somehow we managed to become the most dominant power in the world from 1880 through 1965 and won 2 world wars without having to deal with housing. And Americans, by and large, had the American dream. People came here from around the world to pursue it. And so this is a new phenomenon. This is not something that's been here. Of course, it's now been here almost 90 years, but it's not something that we've had continuously through our time as a government. So we know how to manage without it, but for some reason we don't. Now, one of the things I did was when I researched this, I said, how many agencies in the federal government have the word housing in it or cover housing? And so I went to ChatGPT and I said, as of 2022, how many are there? And it listed a bunch, and it said, there are also various independent regulatory agencies involved in aspects of housing finance and policy, such as, it told there are over a dozen federal entities that play a role. Now, it gives over a dozen, but it doesn't give you a number. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. Why can't it give me a number? So I went to a competitor, Gemini by Google, to ask the exact same question. And they came back with a few of them, multiple agencies, independent agencies. Here's why you can't get a number. And they say it's safe to say multiple federal agencies and departments regulate housing in the U.S., with the exact number being difficult to pinpoint for the reasons above. Can't give us a number, can't give an estimate, can't quote anybody as an estimate. I found that fascinating. Then I went to the latest AI entry, which is Tesla's, or really X.com, or formerly Twitter's, Grok, and asked it. It gave a little more flowery example. After giving me a little overview, it said, remember, the number of agencies in housing regulation is not as important as the fact they'll have a hand in the housing market, like a cosmic dance where everyone wants to lead, but no one knows the steps. And I think that actually portrays what's going on in our housing market is we have so much government interference. It reminds me of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. You remember the classic movie, the ending scene where they stored the tomb, the Ark of the Covenant, which if you're Jewish or you're Christian would be the penultimate article of archaeology in the world. And they took it down this seemingly endless warehouse that the federal government had. It just shows how vast the federal government's resources are and how we struggle to manage things as it gets bigger and bigger. Now, I'm in business. When people hire me to sell a house, I'm in the results business. I either get them the house sold at the right price at the right time, or I run the risk of getting fired. And if I do a good job, I get hired over and over again. If I do a bad job overall, then I'm not going to get any more new business. The federal government, however, while it fails, it launches a new program and a new program, and it continues to grow. And the results have been really nothing short of disastrous. Here's a look at housing affordability just over most of my career. I started in 1986, and it took, at the time, the average home cost about the average income in America. And today, the average home costs twice the income of the average American. Now, this is as of 2018 or 2011, and that number continues to get worse. So it just shows that overall, the housing market has been failing as the more our federal government's got involved. And I wanted to show you this. I thought was a fascinating comparison between housing and other things. While food and clothing, where the government's less involved, has come down dramatically in how much we spend. We're wealthier as a society overall. Where the government's not involved, we have better results. Food costs less, maybe we overeat. I'm guilty of that. We have more clothes, or they cost less. We have iPhones and all kinds of technology. So overall, we live like kings in every area, but housing, you can see it's pretty much stayed about the same, that our percent of housing has continued. Now, you could say we have nicer homes now, bigger homes now, but the percentage of income, we're wealthier, we feel wealthier in terms of other things, but we don't in terms of our housing stock. And that's because it's gotten more expensive as a percentage. Now, where's the culprit? Here's an easy graph that I think points out who's responsible for this change. The amount of financing controlled by the federal government is a monopoly. You have the GSE, which is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. These are two quasi-government agencies. Both are bankrupt, basically. They're in receivership, which means they're incompetent to manage their own financial affairs. I've covered them in previous episodes. You have the FHA loans, which has declined from about 30% of the market down to about 20%, down by 50%. So the low-income housing financing component has gone down. VA, even though our number of veterans has gone up, has stabilized at about 10%. In other, used to be banks and others lend money, but you can see consistently for all this time a very small percentage. So overall, if you add these together, about 97% of all financing, if you exclude this bottom part here, exclude this 3 or 4%, about 97% of financing is controlled by the federal government. And so in any normal business, you'd say, well, if the government is, and here's another graph of the same thing, if they're responsible for all the activity, they're responsible for the results. And here's an example that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and then Ginnie Mae, which are the FHA and VA loans, together control about 90-something% of the home loan market. And you can see it's increased. It used to be down below 30% when I started this career, and now it's up over 97. It's now to 97%. So the government has taken over this business. And of course, it's also taken over banking. And you might say, well, is there anybody thinking about how we should maybe reduce the federal government and have private enterprise? Take a look at space, for example. Since we landed on the moon, and we had a few episodes since, our space activity almost eliminated until Elon Musk and other private entrepreneurs reinvigorated the space business. And now we're back very active in controlling and leading the world in commercial space. So there we got the government out, or the government was inactive and other people stepped in. So what do the government officials and what do the smart people in Washington, D.C. think about? Well, the Brookings Institute is kind of the collection of government bureaucrats, consultants. And what are they thinking about? Well, what can the federal government do to increase the supply of federal housing? Maybe the answer is just stop being the federal government. Maybe just cancel programs. Maybe stop working so hard. What you're doing isn't working. But no, that's not how they think. Here's a paper by Jenny Shoots at Brookings that goes into the details and points out how bad the housing market is and we're missing. And then she goes on to describe about more programs and more things the federal government can do to increase control. And so what happens is, and I created a fancy graph here. The government spends money, then they borrow money to cover the program, then their deficit increases interest rates, then it's hard to afford homes with higher payments. So when it's hard to buy homes, the government spends more money. And the government spends more money, they have to borrow more money. They borrow more money, rates go up. Rates go up, hard to buy houses. The government goes, wow, it's hard to buy houses. We'll spend more money. And so we're in this never-ending cycle now of the government trying to solve a problem while the government is technically bankrupt. I mean, by any standard, the amount of money they owe, the large expense now in the federal government is interest. So the last place that should be leading the government last place that should be leading the housing industry would be the federal government that's proven its inability to manage its own affairs, let alone our affairs. One of the things that changed years ago was the emphasis on stick-built and local-built housing versus manufactured housing. And here's an article in Fortune that says that just changing that requirement in government programs, and the government programs overlap into state and local areas and laws, all of a sudden that would invigorate manufactured housing where they can be built in higher quality and quantity at a cheaper price, and would save home buyers about $175,000 per home because you can manufacture them, off-site, bring them in, snap them up. I live in a house where the first floor was a 1932 built house, and the prior owners to the prior owner, I don't know how long ago, 25, 30 years ago, more, 35 years ago, put a modular home on top as a second floor. I didn't know it was modular all this time, or manufactured off-site and brought in with a crane. So there's all kinds of possible technology available, but we have different regulations that kind of encourage local home building, because those are people who pay campaign contributions to local and state and federal government officials, rather than the manufacturing housing companies, which are much smaller. So again, that's an area where the government has crippled potential growth. One other area is just regulations. And you see overall in our economy, one of the things that hurts our ability to grow is when the federal government makes it harder to do business. And here's a recent example. The banks don't want to inspect your home office, but they're being forced to by federal banking regulators. Now, I understand that there's technical reasons why you may not want to have people work from home to control the internet and control data flows and things like that. And yet I do know that there are companies that give their employees sophisticated laptops with sophisticated data encryption services and can make that work. But the government doesn't like that. They like control. And so they're going to make it harder and harder. They're also going to force home offices to meet office standards, ADA compliant, even if you're not a disabled person. They want to pass those regulations down. And so overall, we have the federal government in a million different ways making it harder and harder, more expensive to work. And this is going to discourage people from working out of their homes, which has been a big push of the last couple of years. COVID really pushed a lot of people. I'm one of them. I used to have to pay money or take a lower commission split to work in an office where I had space. Now I have a very nice home office with better internet, privacy, and I enjoy it. But the government wants to push against that because it's harder for them to regulate. Another area where the federal government is, I think, really seeking to destroy the entire real estate industry is this commission lawsuit. The class action attorney was emboldened because the Department of Justice has been aching to destroy the National Association of Realtors. And one thing you won't find anybody else who'll say this, but I'll say it. National Association of Realtors was the largest lobbying organization in America because of the 1 million plus members of NAR, of realtors. But more than that, they're entrepreneurs. They're not one big company. They're not in favor of regulation. They're not in favor of globalization. Real estate agents by their nature aren't pushing the DEI agenda that the federal government is pushing. And more than that, the NAR is the last large lobbying group that had President Trump speak in front of it. The other ones are scared to get into politics. And so because by nature, and I'm not saying all realtors are conservative or all realtors vote for Trump, but at the end of the day, Trump was a real estate agent on a big scale. And our Department of Justice has clearly set its sights to destroy our industry. And so here we have a case, and this is fantastic, and I talk about this in detail in another video, where this attorney is basically going to prohibit us from offering compensation to brokerage agents anywhere. The lawsuit originally was the MLS shouldn't offer compensation to buyer's agents because it was forcing that offer being made. They were saying, I think falsely, to the detriment of buyers and sellers. And so the Department of Justice now is saying, not only can we not put it in the MLS, because that was anti-competitive, they're saying that as a seller, if you want to sell your house and you hire me as a listing agent, you're not allowed to publicize how much you're offering to buyer's agents who bring a buyer to sell your house. It has to be somehow all verbal, I guess. I don't know how that would work. We still don't know how it works, but it just shows you the Department of Justice forces companies to hire attorneys, spend time on training and paperwork to all of us to cover ourselves, when in reality, it's not going to help sell one more house. It's not going to help one person get a house any cheaper. That's the federal government. There's one attorney who's making this policy. It wasn't voted by Congress. It wasn't debated by politicians. One attorney makes that decision, and the next thing you know, the entire industry is in an uproar. At the same time, you have the Department of Justice saying buyer commission's bad. We have the Veterans Administration saying buyer commissions are so good, we want to make sure we finance them. So the VA's deputy director has made this announcement. Hey, don't worry, we're going to make it available so we can finance this commission that the other organization says you can't even talk about. It just shows how now we have so much government regulation that we have two of them fighting themselves. It reminds me in the scene in the Band of Brothers, I think it was the first or second episode, where the 101st Airborne got the two Nazi groups to be shooting at each other. And they said, well, let's let them continue to do that, because when they're killing each other, it's a good thing. But here, this is bad for all of us, because on one hand, the Department of Justice is limiting our ability to service customers and sell houses. And the VA is saying, oh, it's okay, you can do it. We'll finance it, which is maybe financing something that would be otherwise difficult. So at the end of the day, you look at the results. Housing affordability is harder. The number of homes built in America has stayed the same over the last few years, despite an increasing population. Satisfaction and the feelings of being able to afford the American dream are going down. And why is that? I was saying increasing. It's not just the federal government, the taxes they take from us. It's the programs and regulations, maybe well-intended, maybe not, that have the disastrous effect of making homes more expensive, harder to afford, and going forward, make the business of servicing our customers much more difficult. What are your thoughts? Comment, thumbs up, thumbs down, put a comment, subscribe, reach out to me at Bill Gross Probate and social media. This is the Real Estate Ripoff podcast. I'm at Bill Gross Probate and social media. As always, make today your best day ever. Thanks so much.